Hey, what is going on, guys? Max Settings here, and welcome back to another review. So today we are going to be taking a look at the STAX SR-L700. I know this one was pretty hyped. I've had quite a few people ask me when the review of this was coming out. And the L700 is quite an interesting headphone. I have a lot to say about it and STAX in general. So this is probably going to be a little bit longer of a review, but it should be well worth it. So the STAX SR-L700 is an electrostatic headphone, as STAX headphones are, and this is the current, I guess you could say, flagship of the Lambda series, which is the square or I guess rectangle shaped STAX series, although it is not their STAX's overall flagship. That is the SR-009S. But this is the highest end of the STAX Lambda series, which currently consists of the L300, L300 Limited, L500, and the L700 here. So let's get things started here with a few basic specs as always. So these are an electrostatic headphone. They have a price point of $1,425, frequency response of 7 to 41,000 hertz, an impedance of 145 kiloohms, a sound pressure sensitivity of 101 dB per 100 volts, and a bias voltage of 580 volts. And yeah, I know electrostatic specs are a little weird. So let's talk about the build of the L700. So the L700 is a $1,425 headphone that is built about as well as a $50 headphone. These things feel incredibly cheap. All the plastic is just cheap, thin junk plastic, pretty much all around. I know a lot of people like the Creative Arvana Live. That's like a $60 headphone, and those are quite popular. I think I would trust the Cal not to break before these, because this thing is just, it's just sketchy. This pair is not mine. This was sent out by Flux on Discord. I know he's known to send out a lot of headphone samples to reviewers, so big shout out to him, Flux, and we'll be shouting out him in the next review also. So the top part of the headband is probably the best part of the build of these headphones. Even this is not very good plastic, but this is the sturdiest feeling piece of plastic in the entire headphone. This is still just cheap plastic. You got a leather head strap here, which I think is lamb leather, just like the pads. The pads here are genuine lamb leather. But the yokes on this headphone are just the cheapest feeling plastic there are. Like just the thin little cheap plastic with the little like reinforced triangles because it's kind of hollow. And yeah, those just feel like they're going to break at any second, and they do break a lot. The pair of these that was at Can Jam at the STAX table broke, and then the grills are just that also very same cheap plastic, and it just doesn't feel good at all. And then attached cable. Now of note, there is the new L700 Mark II that is coming out in the US, I believe June 30th, according to the STAX website. And that has made the yokes metal and the cable detachable, which is quite interesting. So that should make these feel a little bit better built, but I believe that is also a little bit more expensive at, I think, $1,500 or slightly over $1,500. So yeah, I would definitely probably try to get a Mark II if you can, because the build on these is quite sketchy. So then as for comfort, the L700 is pretty comfortable. They're not very heavy by any means, and they're not clampy, or not very clampy, at least supposedly this pair isn't. I've heard that they clamp more when they're fresh, but this used pair is not very clampy. The pads are not very thick. Like the back part is, but my ear hits this a little bit, so that's pretty much the only area where the comfort is going to suffer, is your ears might hit the stator or stator or whatever you call that thing inside the headphone here. But yeah, so comfort-wise, these are overall pretty decent. Not the most comfortable thing, certainly not like the HD800 here, but most people shouldn't have any problems with the comfort here on the L700. And then something else I want to talk about here too is the looks. These things are not winning any fashion awards by any means. Now, there's a lot of headphones out there that look weird, but this thing is just ugh, it's just big old rectangle looking thing with cheap glossy plastic. It is quite the ugly headphone. Definitely one of the ugliest headphones I've reviewed for sure. And then as for power requirements, it's a little different because it's an electrostatic headphone. Now, I have not played around with many electrostatic headphones at home, and I was powering these off of the iFi iESL, and the review of that will be out next week, so look forward to that. But on that, I had to take that to the highest gain, and I was using the highest line voltage out of my RME ADI2 DAC, and I was still to take the volume up quite a bit. So these things seem hard to drive for an electrostatic, and I also noticed that at Can Jam I was taking the L700 up higher than I was on like the L300 or L500. So I'm gonna assume these are harder to drive for an electrostatic headphone, but I'm not the most well-versed person in eStats, to be perfectly honest with you, so maybe not, but that's just something I observed, so I thought I would mention that. So, and then as for cables, I mean, the cable's attached, so it's not like you have any choice. At least it's on the Mark 1. It's just a long, I think it's 10-foot, fat ribbon cable. I don't really like the STAX cables, but this is just kind of what you get on STAX headphones, so you don't really have a choice. And then these use the Pro bias, which is the 5-pin. The old or normal bias, I guess is what it's called, uses a 6-pin, so they have an extra pin in the middle. But Pro bias use the 5-pin like that, so that's just a pretty standard STAX plug that all modern STAX headphones have. So nothing unusual there. That is the cable that you get with it. I mean, just an eStat cables are pretty much all like this, except for the Mr. Speaker's Voce, which uses a more traditional looking cable. But I don't know why eStats have to use ribbon cables, but I digress. And then I did want to talk about the box real quick. Once again, $1,425 headphones, and you get this box, just cardboard box with some styrofoam in it, and they're in a plastic bag. No presentation box, nothing nice, just a very cheap box. This feels like a box for once again, a $50 set of headphones. Nothing too special with the box on these, so I just wanted to mention that because just fits in with the whole cheap fit and finish of the L700. Okay, so now let's get into the sound of the L700. This is the long-awaited part here. So starting off with the frequency response and in the bass. So kind of like when I reviewed the cost eStats, the ESP95X, these things have overall kind of a flat bass response, but they roll off in the sub bass region for sure. So it's overall pretty flat, but it rolls off starting around 70 hertz, and by the time you get down to 20, it rolls pretty much all the way off, like 15 dB or so. So not much sub bass on the L700 at all. It's pretty much going to be all mid bass. Anything below 70 hertz just kind of drops right off with the L700, so definitely not good for hitting down low. There's a little bit of a raise at around that 80-90 hertz region, like 2 or 3 dB. It's not like the flattest thing, but then after that, after about 100 hertz all the way until around 800 hertz, it's pretty flat. And then from about 800 hertz to like 1.3 to 1.4K area, there is a little bit of a hump in the mid-range of around 3 or 4 dB. So you have a little bit of shout in that in the lower mid area. And then after that, it begins to dip down. So from about 1.6, 1.7K all the way until around 6K or so, you're going to have a little bit of a recession in the rest of your lower mids and most of your upper mids of around 7 or 8 dB or so. So a little bit recessed in the mids. And then after that, the treble starts to come back up at around 6.5K. So you get a more inline treble region, which is elevated slightly of around 3 or 4 dB from around 6K all the way until about 10K. So these things are very interesting in their frequency response. They're not quite V-shaped because they're a little different than that. They're almost W-shaped, like a little bit elevated in that 100-ish hertz area, or so. And then there's a little bit of elevation in the mids, or that one, like 800 to 1.2K mid area. And then it dips back out again, and then a little bit elevated treble. So these kind of have like a W-shaped frequency response. And these have a strange frequency response. I haven't seen much like this, so that's quite interesting. And apparently these things need a bit of EQ depending on who you ask. And yeah, I can definitely see that because these have a strange frequency response. Okay, so now let's talk about some other things with the L700 here. So as for detail, the L700 does detail really well. I talked about how the HD800 over here did some of the best detail of any headphones out there. And the L700 definitely can play with it, particularly in the treble area. These things are definitely matching, if not beating, the HD800 level of detail in the treble region for sure. I think it lags slightly behind the HD800 in the mids and the bass. I don't think it's quite as resolving in those areas, but it's really close. And it's pretty much a toss-up for detail between the L700 and the HD800. So these are pretty detailed headphones, especially for their $1,425 price tag. These definitely have the detail for their price point. Okay, so now we got to talk about dynamics. So in my book, there's two kinds of dynamics. There's macro and micro dynamics. So macro dynamics is probably going to be more of like what you would call dynamic range, which is the difference in volume between the loudest and quietest parts of the song. So how well the headphone can distinguish between those. And then there's like micro dynamics, which is like how quickly the headphone can transition between, small changes in volume and instruments, so how quick it can transition between things, not so much just the range of high to low. So the L700 suffers in macro for sure. Now, it is better than, I think, any other modern STAX headphone. The only one I've not heard is the 007. We'll talk about the other STAX headphones a little bit when we get into comparisons. But macro, it is lacking a bit. It's definitely lacking in that bass impact. That's one of the areas where it suffers. Now, it's better bass impact than the COS eStats that we talked about a few weeks ago. It has better bass than that. And the bass one, it's kind of interesting. It has a unique impact. I'm not really sure how to describe it. It's not doesn't have too much impact, but it has like an interesting sound when it hits. It's hard to explain. I really don't know how I would explain it. But yeah, so it has a very interesting bass. And then for the microdynamics, it actually has good microdynamics. It transitions between stuff pretty well. And it's really fast. It's that eStat speed that people like to talk about. And it's very open and airy sounding. Soundstage is decently wide. It's not the widest thing. It's not as wide as HD800. It's above average soundstage for sure. Kind of maybe like the LCD2 or something like that, where it's pretty wide but not insanely wide. And then as for other things with the L700, the one area where these suffer the most, but for sure, is timbre. This is that unnatural eStat timbre. Just stuff on these just doesn't sound natural at all. I was listening to some piano tracks with these because the treble on these sounds really good because of the speed, but it just doesn't sound right. You listen to a piano and it sounds really detailed, but the piano doesn't sound like a piano. It sounds really weird. And then I want to shout out a track here. So go look up Video Game Music Box. It's some artist who recreates classic video game soundtracks on a music box. And look up Rito Village from The Legend of Zelda by Video Game Music Box. That's a really nice recording. And you're listening to these chimes, and it sounds really good. But then you listen to another headphone, and you're like, oh yeah, that's what a chime is supposed to sound like. And these just don't sound right at all. Nothing sounds natural in how it's supposed to sound. It is one of the most unnatural sounding timbres of any headphone ever. And there's going to be a worse sounding thing, or worse sounding timbre coming pretty shortly in the forms of an IEM. But the timbre on these is just weird. Nothing sounds natural at all. So that is my biggest gripe about electrostatics and STAX in particular. Supposedly the Sennheiser stats actually have pretty decent timbre, but I've never heard a Sennheiser E-stat. So yeah, that's gonna be my biggest complaint about the L700. So weird frequency response, not very good macro dynamics, really good detail, decent soundstage, and really unnatural timbre on the L700 here. So now as for comparisons, okay, so now let's talk about how the L700 compares to other STAX headphones. So as I mentioned, I've heard every other modern STAX headphone except for the 007, and I don't like any of them. The L700 is the only modern STAX headphone that I've heard, which I might like the 007, but I haven't heard it, that I like. I don't like the L300, I don't like the 300 Limited, I don't like the 500, and I don't like the 009 or the 009S. Reason being, this is the only one that has really any bass. They all have weird frequency response, they all don't have very good dynamics, and this is the only one that has any sort of bass impact. You listen to the 009 and the 009S, and they are really resolving. Like the treble in those sounds good, but they are so thin and they don't have good dynamic range. They just you listen to the bass and the bass hits and there's no hit. It has no impact at all. And the same thing applies to the 300 and the 500 and 300 Unlimited. They just, none of them have any good bass and any good impact. And then you just have the weird timbre and weird frequency response. So all you get is that good detail and the speed, but everything else sounds unnatural. You have no impact. The dynamic range isn't that good. And it's just like, yuck. So this is the only modern STAX headphone that I like until I hear the 007, which I might like the 007, which supposedly from friends of mine who have heard all of them, the 007 is kind of like a super L700, so I probably will like the 007. So yeah, I just don't like these compared to any other STAX headphone. Now, this is probably the best E-stat that I've heard to date compared to the cost, the Mr. Speakers Voce, and the other STAX headphone. This is my favorite E-stat headphone. And to be honest, I would own the L700 if it wasn't an E-stat. I really do like these a lot. They're very interesting to listen to, and they're kind of fun, but I just don't like them enough to drop $1,400 or like $1,100 on a used pair and then buy an Energizer. Don't like them that much. If they were not an E-stat, I'd probably pick up a pair because they're kind of fun, but yeah, I'm just not ready to invest extra money in an Energizer for these STAX here. So then as for some other comparisons, I mainly compare to the HD800. As I mentioned, the detail between the two is very close. The HD800 detail is pretty top tier. The HD800, while the timbre on them is not very good, it is still a lot better than the STAX. These are also wider, and comfort on these is better. Build is way better, even though I didn't particularly like the build on the HD800. So these two are going to be probably a toss-up depending on who you are and what you prefer. A lot of people like this open, airy E-stat sound. Some people don't. And once again, Energizer for these. So there's going to be an added cost that's not cheap to get a STAX Energizer, unless you get like something from like Yahoo Auctions Japan or something like that. And yeah, so that's pretty much what the best comparison to the L700 is going to be, the HD800, unless you want to compare to other STAX, but I don't like other STAX, so, you know. And one more thing I want to mention here at the end is I don't like the STAX community for the most part. A lot of them are just pretty whack. They're people that think that anything that's not an E-stat is just trash, it's muddy, it's garbage, and STAX, zero distortion, yada, 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 all this junk. And I know there's going to be people that are going to be like, oh, you listen to it on an iESL? That thing's junk. What you got to do is you got to get the 1977 SRD ZX Gamma Alpha Mega, and you got to desolder the caps and do some, they're just whack people like that. Don't be those people. STAX are interesting, but these are not like the be-all end-all of headphones by any means. So in conclusion, the L700 is quite a good headphone actually. It has some very glaring flaws. Weird frequency response, weird timbre, not very good macro dynamics, but really good detail, great speed, and an interesting presentation of sound. And I really do enjoy listening to them a lot. And like I said, I'd own them if they weren't in eStat. But I think that if you do want to try an eStat and get into some electrostatic headphones, this would definitely be the one that I would take a look at. And I have another eStat review coming out pretty soon, probably next week or so, and you'll have to look forward to that. But yeah, L700, good. Would get my recommendation among eStats, although it's going to be a very niche recommendation. So take a look at them. You might like them, you might not, but I like them, although they are weird. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed my review of the L700 here. Links to where to buy, I guess now the Mark II, in the description, as well as the MiniDSP EARS graph, my Twitter, my contact email, and all other relevant information. But anyway, guys, I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye.